Good evening and welcome to BIC Streams. We are honored to have with us today Professor Elaine Pagels, distinguished historian on the religions of late antiquity, who comes to us from Princeton, New Jersey. Her lecture this evening on the Gospel of Thomas is titled Unravelling the Secret Gospels. Welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you, and thank you.
This evening's lecture is in association with the Bangalore Literature Festival, which is being held at BIC this year on December 18th and 19th. And this event is in the series of curtain raisers leading up to the festival. Professor Pagels' lecture today is based on her work that appears in the volume Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas. Here it is, which was a New York Times notable book and national bestseller. In 1945, an Egyptian peasant unearthed what proved to be the Gnostic Gospels, the sacred books of one of the earliest Christian sects. And today, Professor Pagels will draw on her landmark study to illuminate the world of the first Christians, focusing on the secret Gospel of Thomas, which is particularly relevant to Indian traditions of Christianity. For a brief introduction, Professor Elaine Pagels is the Harrington Spear Payne Foundation Professor of Religion at Princeton University. Among her many honors are a MacArthur Prize Fellowship, commonly referred to as the Genius Grant, and the National Medal for the Humanities from President Barack Obama in 2016. The citation for the award honored her for her exploration of faith and its traditions. It said, through her study of ancient manuscripts and other scholarly work, she has generated new interest and dialogue about our contemporary search for knowledge and meaning. Her book, The Gnostic Gospels, won the National Book Award, among other distinctions, and her most recent book, Why Religion, combines autobiography with her reflections on the history of religion. I know that in the past few weeks, in anticipation of today's talk, some of our audience members have read this book on their Kindles, and we hope we will have some time to discuss it. A detailed biography with more of her publications is available in the chat box and on our website. Professor Pagels will take questions from the audience after her talk. You can type your questions in the Q&A box as we go along. And with that, I turn the floor over to you, Professor Pagels.
Thank you so much. As I said, I'm very happy to be here and share this work with you and other colleagues. So I'll start to share the screen because, as you said, my work is focused on the discovery of some secret gospels, which have really changed and are changing the way we understand the history of religion, which is my field of study. Now, people who know the New Testament know that the Christian Bible includes 4 gospels. They're traditionally thought to be written within 30, 40, 50, 60 years after the death of Jesus. And gospel means the good news about Jesus. But the question, which is quite an open question here, is what actually is the good news? What is there to say about Jesus and the tradition that he articulated? And now we have some entirely new understanding of that because of the discovery that was just mentioned. In Upper Egypt in 1945, some gospels, other gospels were found, many others that we had heard about from antiquity. And as we heard, in 1945, it was an Egyptian farmer who said that he was looking for fertilizer among the cliffs in Upper Egypt near Luxor. And in a large jar, 6-foot jar, he found 13 bound volumes with over 50 texts in them. These were ancient texts. They were written originally in Greek, which was the language of Egypt 2,000 years ago. And then they were translated into Coptic, which is also a language that became commonly spoken in Egypt shortly after that. And these secret texts included at least 5 gospels that offered secret teaching of Jesus. Now, people had said these were lost gospels, but they weren't actually lost. They had been buried, denounced, and destroyed by certain leaders of the church who called them heresy. But when one of the first scholars, a French scholar named Jean Dorès, began to read them, he looked at them, and this was the first line of the Gospel of Thomas. These are the secret sayings of the living Jesus. And Thomas, the twin, wrote them down. And Dorès thought to himself, wait a minute, did Jesus have secret teachings which we don't know? And did he have a twin named Thomas? We never heard that before. When I first encountered these texts, and when they were finally made available to students and faculty at Harvard University, where I was a student, I read from the Gospel of Thomas this line, and I was completely fascinated. Here, according to the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And I thought, well, that's remarkable. You don't have to believe that. It just happens to be true. Now, the context in which I was reading this is Harvard University, as I mentioned, a traditional institution, of course. This on the left is my wonderful teacher, Krister Stendahl, who said, now, you know, of course, that these are the wrong gospels. These are false. These are heretical. And the university was founded by the person seated in the chair here, his statue. His name is Harvard, and he was a Christian professor who founded the university to preach the truth of Christ in his church. And my professor said, these are definitely not the truth of Christ in his church, because these texts were not, as I said, lost. People knew in the thousands of years ago that there were many other gospels besides the ones that are now in the New Testament. However, these many other gospels were denounced, as we said, as heresy. Bishop Irenaeus was a famous spokesman for the early Orthodox Church who said, the heretics say they have more gospels than there really are, but theirs are only an abyss of insanity and blasphemy against Christ. And that judgment was echoed when my book, The Gnostic Gospels, came out in the New York Times. And the reviewer, who was a Roman Catholic priest, said, yes, they were rubbish then, and they're still rubbish. Pretending anything else is deceiving the public. So that's the reception these Gospels first received when they emerged among Orthodox Christians. The first stage of research included a number of scholars, French, Egyptian, and Dutch. And they published the first edition of the Gospel of Thomas. And they said, well, is this gospel like the early gospels? They said, well, it's really a false gospel, so it must be a late one. And so they dated it twice as late as the Gospel of Mark, which is understood to be the earliest gospel written after the death of Jesus. So this was the first stage of research, which regarded this as a kind of anomaly. The second stage of research began when I was in graduate school. And some of the Harvard professors, including the professor of New Testament, Helmut Kester, said, wait a minute. Before there were the New Testament Gospels, which tell stories of Jesus and include his teaching, there would have been just lists of the teaching of Jesus that were created separately. And this is what was found, the Gospel of Thomas, was simply a list. It's only consists of about 15 pages. And it's one saying after the other. Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. And he said, this may be the earliest source we have. This may be the most authentic teaching of Jesus. I would say presently, there's a great debate going on internationally among scholars. And some take the view that this text is very valuable for the understanding of how the Christian movement was shaped, and others claim it is derivative and worthless. I give you two examples. But both agree that the Gospel of Thomas probably has very early sayings of Jesus in it, and also has some sayings that were added later. So Hans Martin Schenke at the University of Berlin said this is a very valuable source, very important. And Simon Gathercole at Cambridge University, who, by the way, is a theologian rather than a historian, says, this text is derivative, it is late, and it is worthless. And so the controversy is still building. A major question, though, is whether Jesus actually had a secret teaching, because there's almost nothing in the New Testament Gospels that suggests that he that offers secret teaching. So the earliest antagonist of these secret Gospels, a bishop then living in what is now France, he was a Syrian missionary to the people in France. He said there is no genuine secret teaching. Jesus did not do that. But the earliest New Testament gospel account in the New Testament says that Jesus did have secret teaching. Geza Vermesh, a prominent scholar of New Testament, said if Jesus taught the way other rabbis did, he would have taught in two different ways. Rabbis then and now, like many spiritual teachers, will teach one thing to a large congregation and another thing to their own closest disciples in private. And Vermesh certainly thought the Gospel of Thomas was secret teaching, because this text looks very much like other teaching of famous rabbis. The ones on the right here, the left is the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic, and on the right is the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, a Jewish text about a famous rabbi whose name was also Jesus, but a different one. And Pirkei Avot is the sayings of the fathers, which were traditionally collected in lists of sayings, just like the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the New Testament contains the earliest Gospel of Mark, as we mentioned. This one was written probably 40 years after the death of Jesus, the earliest one we have. And it says that when Jesus was alone with his disciples, they asked him questions, and he said to them, "To you alone, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given, but not to people outside." And the word he uses for secret, mysterion, the Greek, mystery, mystery or secret, is given only to those in the inner circle. Now, the New Testament Gospels do not claim to offer Jesus' secret teaching, or very obliquely. So the secret of the kingdom of God, whatever Jesus meant by that, is not explained in the New Testament Gospels, although Jesus speaks of it all the time. But the Gospel of Thomas does claim to reveal much more about the secret of the kingdom of God. Here, Jesus seems to ridicule what many Christian teachers say and says, if your leaders tell you, look, the kingdom is up there in the sky, then the birds will get there first. If they say it's in the sea, then the fish will get there first. But the kingdom of God is within you, and it is outside of you. And when you come to know who you are, then you will know that you are the children of the living God. So the Gospel of Thomas suggests that while many Christians think of the kingdom of God either as heaven, where you may arrive after death, or they think of it as something happening at the end of time, the Gospel of Thomas says, no, it's not an event in time, it's not a place in space. Instead, it's a state of being. And that's where we get the statement that the kingdom of God is within you. When you come to know who you are, you will come to understand the kingdom of God. So the question in the Gospel of Thomas that the other disciples asked Jesus is, well, how can you look for it? When is the kingdom going to come? And here Jesus says, well, don't look to the end of time. Go back to the beginning. You might even go back before the beginning of time. That seems, of course, like the paradox that it is how can you go back before the beginning of time? Well, any rabbi would have said, oh, we know how to do that. You go back to the biblical book of Genesis. That tells you what happened before the world was created in Jewish tradition. And there in Genesis, it says, in the beginning, there was darkness and a wind from God over the deep abyss. That's all there was, a kind of watery chaos. And then, according to Genesis, the text says that God spoke and said, let there be light. And the original creation was light, but it wasn't the light of the sun or the moon, because the world had not yet been created, according to this teaching. Instead, this light is a kind of primordial energy. The Greek word is phos, from which we get in English the word phosphorescent or, light. It also is a pun on the word for human being. So it's almost as though there's a primordial energy, which is pictured as light, but not the light of the sun or the moon. Also in this text, when people ask Jesus, who are you? He doesn't speak about being the Messiah of Israel or the Savior of the world or any of that. He speaks as if he's a kind of voice that manifests the primordial energy of the universe, the primordial light. There's a saying that I think is quite lovely and very different from anything we have in other Christian tradition. Jesus says, I am the light that is before all things. I am all things. Lift up a piece of wood or split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a rock, and you will find me. So it's as though this divine energy from which the world comes forth pervades everything there is, not only human beings, but also the sun, the moon, the stars, the trees, the rocks, the stones, everything. And when the rabbis asked the question, well, Genesis also says God created humans in his image, a famous painting by Michelangelo in the 16th century. But they would ask, but what image? Because in Jewish tradition, one cannot make an image of God. It is forbidden to make an image the way that Christian painters like this one did centuries later. So if God created humans, if we are created in the image of God, what does that mean? One of the prophets of Israel, Ezekiel, said that he had a vision, famous vision. And in that vision, he saw the Lord on the throne, except he said, I didn't really quite see a human being. What I saw was light. I saw rainbows and I saw flashing jewels. I saw crystal sea. I saw lightning and fire. And I saw kavod, which in Hebrew means glory, shining, radiance. So in Jewish tradition, the only image you can use for the God who cannot be imaged is light. And this is an image created also much later by a Christian artist who could dare picture a human form in that light as a Jewish mystic could not. The Gospel of Thomas says, how do you find the divine light? The beginning of this text opens and says, let the person seek, keep on seeking till he finds. When he finds, he'll be troubled. And when he's troubled, he'll be astonished. How do you find the light? Well, Thomas has said, you have to bring forth something that's already intrinsically within you, whether you know it or not. So the disciples keep asking Jesus, as they do in the New Testament, well, tell us show us where we have to go. Tell us what we have to know. And here Jesus does not do that. He says, no, look within yourself. Because the question of this gospel is not about who is Jesus. The question is, who are you? Who do you think you are? Who are any of us? Now, we all know how we identify ourselves. Our ordinary identification, the birth certificate, the passport, the driver's license, identifies us by what differentiates this person from everyone else, by gender, by ethnicity, by age, by characteristics, everything. We identify specifically by difference. But spiritual identity, according to the Gospel of Thomas, shows us how we are the same. So here in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus offers a kind of initiation ritual. It's a kind of spiritual baptismal question. It's the kind of question that you hear when you go from one country to another. The question, who are you? Where do you come from? How do you identify yourself? The kind of question your passport could answer. But here the answers are different. So Jesus says, when they ask you, where do you come from? You don't say, what, United States or India or anywhere else like that. He says, say, we come from the light. We come from where the light came into being at the beginning of time, and it established itself in the image of God. And when they say to you, well, who are you then? Just say, we are children of the light, children of the living Father. That is to say, we are all from the same family. We all come from the same divine source. And when they ask, how do you identify yourself? He says, well, say movement and rest. This is like the beginning chapter of Genesis, which speaks about how God creates and then rests. So here, identity is not about me or you. It is about all of us. We all come from the same spiritual place. We all come from the divine source. We all are children, as we said, of the same family, and we all identify in the same way. Now, to find that light, according to the Gospel of Thomas, you have to look within. This is a saying 24. Jesus said, within a person of light, there's light. Now, if the light is illuminated, it lights up the whole world. If not, everything is dark. So one has to seek within and discover that spiritual source, which is hidden, understood to be hidden, and often not perceptible to the ordinary way of looking within each of us. So the Gospel of Thomas pictures Thomas as the twin, because his name in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, is a nickname for twin, Thomas, and he's also called Didymus, which in Greek means twin. So the Gospel of Thomas keeps calling the person who presumably wrote it as the twin, the twin. And although the original readers of this text, when they found it in 1945, said, is he Jesus's twin? What does that mean? Did Jesus have a twin brother? Well, of course, this is not meant literally here. But the idea is that when you come to know who you are, you know that you are children of the living God, just the way Jesus is. And Jesus is, in fact, seen as the spiritual twin of each one who recognizes his or her origin coming from that same divine source. So in this gospel, Jesus says, in effect, you are my twin. or I am your twin. The saying 108, he says, whoever drinks from my mouth, that's a metaphor for accepting his teaching. Whoever hears me will become like me, and I will become that person, and the mysteries will be revealed to him. So there's the deep connection with the spiritual source from which we all come that is spoken of here. Now, what makes this kind of gospel heresy? The word heresy, which was taken by many people to mean false, misleading, wrong, even sinful, actually means choice. And what makes these gospels so objectionable to later Christians as they developed the Christian movement into an institutional church, or into a series of institutional churches, is that they did not want to speak about Jesus as similar to you or me or anyone else. The Gospels of the New Testament, each one suggests that Jesus is utterly unique. Unique in the history of the world. There's only one person, you know, this tradition is part of what many Christians say. Jesus is the only person who is uniquely connected with God. Mark speaks of him as Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. The Gospel of John takes it to a much higher register and basically says, Jesus is the only Son of God. And the word that John always uses for Jesus is the Greek monogenos, which means single-born, unique, utterly unique. There is no one in the universe like Jesus, so they claim. So the New Testament Gospels, as you know, tend to speak of Jesus as the only Son of God, God incarnate in human form, as no one else, they claim, has ever been. And so you see this in the United States very often on billboards. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Whoever believes in him has everlasting life. That's on billboards. They don't usually continue with what is also in the Gospel of John, that whoever does not believe in Jesus as the only Son of God goes into eternal damnation. John's Gospel is probably written after the Gospel of Thomas. And I think it was done as a response. Someone wanted to refute the teaching of the Gospel of Thomas. Whoever wrote the Gospel of John, we're not sure who the author is because the title, the Gospel according to John was given to it considerably after it was written. But it's attributed to a disciple of Jesus, which could not have been the author because it's written much later. But the Gospel of John actually finds the teaching of Thomas so objectionable that the author writes a refutation and turns Thomas, the disciple who presumably claims to be the twin of Jesus, and claims that we all have that same spiritual potential. This Gospel of John turns Thomas into a caricature, into the one that is called in Catholic tradition doubting Thomas, because Thomas is the one who doesn't believe anything. Thomas is the one who doesn't believe Jesus could be raised from the dead until he could actually, he says, poke his finger into the wounds of Jesus after he comes back from the dead. And this is a famous painting by the Italian painting Caravaggio, showing that Jesus comes back resurrected, says, Thomas, stop doubting, you should believe, and Thomas gets to do a physical examination of the resurrected Jesus. This is a strange story, but it is the extreme to which John's Gospel will go to denigrate the teaching in the Gospel of Thomas. Because the Gospel of Thomas teaches the opposite of John. Not that Jesus is the only person unique in the history of the world, to be the Son of God, but that Jesus manifests what is potentially in all of us, the divine, a connection with the divine source. So as you see in Orthodox teaching, whether it's Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, the idea is clear that what we speak of as divine and what we speak of as human are opposites. Famous Jewish historian Martin Buber says God is wholly other than human. There's a complete disconnect, not a complete disconnect. There's a relationship of the creator and the creation, but they are ontologically entirely distinct. Mystical teaching, as you know, esoteric teaching in many traditions speaks quite differently. It speaks of the divine and the human as connected, connected because the divine is the source of our humanity and our being, and suggests that we are intrinsically connected with that source. And because we have deep within us a hidden connection, we can return to that source. We can discover that source within us. So these are texts we call Gnostic. It's a Greek word for knowledge, but knowledge is a misleading translation because gnosis is not knowledge seen in the mind. Greek, like many languages, has two words for knowledge. One is eidein, which means to have seen. So an idea, which comes from that, an idea literally means from Greek, something you have seen. So if somebody says cat, you have seen a cat and you have a mental picture of that being, and that is an idea. So these are mental constructs. That's knowledge seen in the mind. But this gnosis is not that kind of mental knowledge. It's not even theological knowledge. Instead, it comes from the word gnosis, which is in the English word recognize. Just as in French, it would be the difference between savoir and connaître, or in Spanish, conocer and saber. In German, it's kennen and wissen. Gnosis is knowledge of the heart. It's, do you know that person? Do you know yourself? Do you know God? That kind of deep inner heart connection. That's understood to be gnosis. And these Gnostic Gospels speak about knowing God, not in the mind, but in the heart, primarily. This is the paradox of this kind of teaching. It speaks of things we cannot know. And what we cannot know is the source, the divine source. We cannot comprehend the source from which we come with our minds. But we can know, and this is the heart knowledge, that we're indissolubly connected with that source and with all being. I am thinking that you can hear the connection with traditions that are also well known in India. Now, let's go back for a moment, because between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas, there are two ways this Christian movement could go in conclusion. It could follow the path of the Gospel of John and say there is one human being in the history of the human race, who was himself divine and connects you with God. And if you are connected with Jesus, then you can achieve salvation. Or there's the way of the Gospel of Thomas, which says Jesus manifests a potential in all human beings, since we all come from the divine source and we can all recognize that we may recover that awareness ourselves. But when Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian in the 4th century of the Common Era, he wanted to establish a universal church. The word is Katholike, it means the whole world. And for him, being the Roman emperor, the whole world meant the Roman Empire, of course. That's all he considered was the world. And he wanted to create a religious tradition that would encompass his entire empire and be the only possible source of salvation. And so he gathered the bishops together and asked them to create a creed and a collection of books that would validate that point of view. And he enlisted the help of bishops like Irenaeus, who said, apart from the Catholic universal church, there is no salvation. So the Christian bishops met in what is now part of Lebanon, and they collected not only a creed, which speaks about Jesus as God from God, light from light, true God from true God, not a human being, but divine incarnation, unlike anyone else in the history of the world. And they collected the New Testament Gospels that would support that interpretation. So they created a canon, which is a standard, literally means in Greek, a standard of what's appropriate to read in worship. And those consist, as you know, of the 4 Gospels now in the New Testament. The Gospel of Thomas and the others were thrown into the Nile, burned, censored, and destroyed. The bishop also ordered the monks who had collected these secret Gospels in their monastery libraries to take them out of the monastery libraries, stop reading them in their devotionals, and destroy them. But there were some Coptic monks who disobeyed the bishop. They took these sacred books and hid them in a jar, sealed carefully, and hidden in a cave, a burial cave that was used in Egypt for thousands of years in order to preserve them. And that's where they stayed for nearly 2,000 years until they were found in 1945 and really only published definitively at the beginning of the 21st century. So this changes our picture of the early Christian movement if you find these texts illuminating, as I do. And there are still many who absolutely reject them. But this Thomas is, of course, the apostle, tradition says, is the apostle of India and the founder of the great church, the Thomas Church in India. And his tradition, sometimes I think, was shaped also by the influence of traditions that came from Egypt and India, Buddhist traditions, which were known in that part of the world, and also Hindu traditions, perhaps. Who knows? And so with that, I'd like to stop for now and open up a time we could talk together.
Well, thank you for that fascinating glimpse into the world of the Gospel of Thomas and into the Gospel itself. As you say, if nothing else, these texts reveal that early Christianity had a much wider range of Christian groups and was more diverse than we had thought. So could you tell us a bit more about your own journey as a young graduate student, your trip to Egypt, to return the Gospels and so on? The search and discovery of ancient relics, as you know, has entered popular culture with films such as Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons. And so could you tell us about your own journey?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I was brought up in California, and in a family that was basically shaped by Christian culture, but secular, because my father, having been brought up in a severely Presbyterian family, rejected the kind of Christianity that he had learned as soon as he learned about Darwin. And so he just said, well, these old stories are useless and worthless, and only uneducated people would ever think about the Bible and those kinds of traditions. So he had no use for religious tradition. This was a secular world and a materialist world. And that's how I grew up, loving poetry and music, until when I was in high school, about the age of 14, someone took me to an evangelical rally of the evangelist Billy Graham. There were 18,000 people in a sports stadium in San Francisco. And he talked about Jesus and loving Jesus with your whole heart and how your life can be transformed. It was quite a wonderful and powerful experience, and so unknown to me that I just loved it. It opened up the imagination in ways. And so I went down and was born again and was saved and joined an evangelical church. And it opened, as I said, the imagination and the possibility of a spiritual life to me in its own way. But it was a rather limited one, because it was one insular, it's like only the people in that particular group could be saved, right? Everybody else was lost, including my Jewish friends, including anyone else who wasn't born again. So after a year, I just kind of had to burst out of it and went off to study dance and do other things, left religion behind. And some years later, I thought, there's something that was so powerful about an opening to what religious traditions have to offer. Was it Christianity? Could it have been another religion? Could it have been Buddhism? If I had been born in another culture? I was curious. So I went back to graduate school Harvard at that time was secular. And I was pretty clear I wasn't going to be brainwashed into a particular religious ideology. And I wanted to learn, what do we know about Jesus? What do we know about that tradition? I was shocked, particularly, to find out that my professors suddenly had access to all these secret gospels. They hadn't been translated yet because they'd been hidden by scholars. And we had the first opportunity to read them. I was delighted. And I thought, these make sense to me in a different way. They open up the world. They open up the sense of a spiritual life in a much more capacious dimension. And so I began to explore them, and I find them transforming the way we understand. See, what we thought was Christianity is quite a narrow stream of what became Orthodox and what was endorsed as Orthodox, which means literally straight thinking. And everything that didn't fit into that category was relegated to heresy and discarded. Everything that speaks in ways that, like the Gospel of Thomas. So I now think that if we understand Christian tradition better, we would understand its connection with so many other traditions, how deeply imbued it is with not only with Jewish tradition, but Buddhist tradition, which was known in Egypt at the time that Jesus's teaching was becoming well known. And there were people going on the Silk Road to India and seeking wisdom from Hindu sages, going from Greece to learn the wisdom of the East as well. So there was a lot of transmission. And when I was in graduate school, the Dutch professor who had actually secretly smuggled the Gospel of Thomas out of Egypt, that was a crime because you're not supposed to remove antiquities, right? But he got away with it at the Cairo airport. At the time I was in graduate school, he was required to return it to Egypt. So we all went back to Egypt, were the guests of the Coptic community, and returned the Gospel of Thomas to Egypt. Now it's in Cairo, in the Cairo Museum.
He had given it to Carl Jung, had he not?
Pardon me?
He had given it to Carl Jung.
Yes, it was. Oh, that's right. That's an important part of it. He had actually given it as a birthday gift to Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, on Jung's 80th birthday. And Jung loved it because he saw it as an opening of the mind, which it is. But then it was formally returned to Egypt. But now it is known all over the world because we have, of course, photocopies of all the texts. And we're exploring not only this text, I just mentioned one that I happen to love, but there are others which have other insights about the breadth and depth of traditions that had previously been completely discarded.
So if I may continue a bit with the autobiography, could you tell us what brought you then to write Why Religion? Why is religion still around in the 21st century?
Yes, that's a question that I was asking myself, having been told that it was all, useless old folklore. Why is it still around? Why are the religious traditions speaking so powerfully to people? I mean, that question is what motivates my research. And I find myself also loving this as a spiritual search. It's not simply an intellectual one, although I'm a historian, and when I write, I try to keep it that way. But I was looking for more than that. I was looking for spiritual truth. So when I wrote Why Religion, I never thought I would write about my own life. That was 35 years later. I was writing about how a scholar and those historical questions connect with very deeply personal questions. So the book combines those. We're not supposed to do that as scholars. We're not supposed to talk about the personal questions. It's kind of a taboo about that. But I thought, why is there? Because for people, as you know, I'm sure, being a scholar, people who choose to study whatever it is, whether it's art history or the politics of the 20th century or ancient Greek or ancient Hindi sources, they're doing so for reasons which are particular to that person. And if the work has passion and power, it usually comes out of those kinds of questions.
But you also speak about the place of pain and tragedy, and what drew you in your own life to some of the churches, the church in New York in particular.
Yes, I mean, it was, as for many people, we come to these questions when we have the most need. And this was when my late husband and I had a child that we adored, and he was given a terminal diagnosis with a very rare illness called pulmonary hypertension. There was nothing we could do. And those kinds of helplessness throw us back on what we don't know and how do we deal with them. And these traditions have been a way to do that. I realized when I sort of listened to some powerful music walking into a church on Fifth Avenue, that even that institution is one which talks about death and talks about what's transcendent beyond this life. So I was looking for that as well, absolutely. And so the book is a very personal book, but it's also about this spiritual search that's part of the exploration of the secret Gospels. And now, many people who have been brought up with Christian tradition are finding these texts opening up another dimension. They find even their tradition more capacious than the churches ordinarily allow. I recently spoke in a synagogue and spoke about the Gospel of Thomas, which at first shocked the rabbi that I suggested it, talk about Jesus in a synagogue. But I said, well, this isn't a Christian story. Jesus, after all, wasn't a Christian. Christianity was invented after his death. So this is a story that comes out of very ancient traditions, and those traditions survive only if they speak to us now.
We'll take an audience question. Professor Annie Chandy Matthew says, as one of the St. Thomas Christians of India, I'm troubled by mainstream institutional Christianity and its dogmas that exclude others. Your inspired interpretation of the Gospel of St. Thomas, non-canonical, even heretical, resonates with me. The Blakean suggestion that each one of us has with us an eternal spark waiting to blaze forth, that we are all children of the light, that primordial force that existed in the beginning and to which we will return is wonderful, inclusive teaching and just what this divided world needs. I loved the reminder that it is not a crime to doubt, for as Tennyson says, there lives more faith in honest doubt than in half the creeds, the Nicene Creed included. She is a scholar of Romanticism, so you see the references to Blake there.
Well, that was so beautifully said. I want to thank her for that eloquent speech, because in the early movement, the Christian tradition had, as every other tradition I know, has a public teaching, elementary teaching, and has a mystical teaching. But in Christianity, the mystical teaching had to cleave very closely to Orthodox Catholic doctrine. The institutional church excluded what was the mystical teaching of the early Christian movement, which you find in Thomas. And if you add that, as the professor says, there is much greater expansion. And Thomas was the one who brought this. He's accused of being a doubter by the author of the Gospel of John, but actually he's one who focuses not so much on belief, but on internal experience. It's based on an experiential desire to connect with the divine source.
I think there have been several writers of the present day, and you mentioned them in your book, Toni Morrison, Leslie Marmon Silko, and others, Rilke, Tolstoy.
Yes.
But Toni Morrison, Leslie Marmon Silko in particular, have drawn inspiration from these texts, from that poem, Thunder. And you say that when you entered college, you decided to learn Greek to read the New Testament in its original language,
Yes.
hoping to discover the source of its power. And could you describe that experience of reading and also the encounter with classical literature, Homer, Sophocles, Pindar, Sappho, which you say was also religious literature, but of a different kind? I ask this because, you know, the experience of reading a classical language, whether it is Sanskrit, Arabic, Greek, or Latin, is sadly one that fewer students are having these days. And your book is so rich with these discussions. So could you tell us about discovering the Gospels in the original Greek?
Yes, that's such a wonderful thing. First of all, it slows you down when you're learning and you read even in John's Gospel, it becomes a very different source when you read the Greek and it says enerche and hologos, and you realize that those words have depth that you don't experience the same way in English. And also these texts, all of these sources, Jesus spoke Aramaic, right, which is a dialect of Hebrew. We don't have his words in Aramaic because his followers wrote for a wider audience in the Roman Empire, and Greek was the lingua franca, basically, of that world. So even Jews often read their own scriptures in Greek. But these texts shine through the language we have, which is now Coptic, and they offer much more. But let me mention that what you said reminds me of some of the other texts, which open another dimension, which is, for the most part, closed in Orthodox Christian tradition, which has to do with the sacredness of the feminine divine element. And may I show you some of that?
Sure.
Just for a moment. We have here, let's see, I'm wondering if we can go back here. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene was found actually in 1896 by British archaeologists. And this is a text that was widely known, also called Terrible Heresy, attributed to Mary Magdalene, who in this text is seen as a major disciple, not just as one of the women, and certainly not as a prostitute, as Catholic tradition later pictured her. That's not in the New Testament. It was invented by one of the popes. The text is now lost. 13 pages are gone. It was translated into 13 languages. We only have a fragment, this is a picture of it, in Ethiopic. And it shows an argument between Peter and Mary Magdalene, because Peter objects that she is not a true disciple. And so he complains that Mary has no right to speak among the disciples. But Mary speaks for herself and claims that she has visions from the Lord, which the Orthodox Church denies. And she is not the kind of saint in Western Christianity that she is in this text, as one of the closest disciples of Jesus. And also in some of these other texts, like the secret revelation of John, you get this other dimension in which the disciple John, after Jesus dies, is grieving because of the death of Jesus. He's devastated, and he goes out in the desert alone and weeps. And he says the earth shook, and he saw a brilliant light, and a voice spoke out of the light. And the voice said, John, why do you weep? I am the one who is with you always. I am the Father, I am the Mother, and I am the Son. And here you see, this is exactly about the issue you raised about translation. Because in Hebrew, the word spirit, ruah, is a feminine word. So the idea of Father and Holy Spirit would naturally be interpreted with the metaphors of Father and Mother, the Holy Spirit and the Heavenly Father. And when you translate spirit or breath from Hebrew into Greek, it becomes a neuter word. So it has no gender, and it becomes a Holy Spirit. But in these texts, the Divine Mother is acknowledged as also in, of course, in many other religions, in every other one, Egyptian, in Babylonian, Indian, there are images of the sacred in feminine form, which is usually absent in, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, Christian teaching.
How were these texts experienced? Were they read out loud by a reader or cantor? What would literacy have been like in the ancient world?
That's such a good question. Most likely, people estimate that perhaps 10 to 15% of people could read. So these texts would have been spoken, and some of them would have been chanted. They would have been chanted or prayed or preached. And they were often the ones that we found in the monastery library in Upper Egypt. That is, they were originally in that library before they were hidden in the cave when censored by the bishop. They were read in devotions at night as the monks, both men and women, would be, after the evening meal, they would listen to the reader reading a devotional passage for meditation and contemplation.
The question of dates, we have a few questions here on the question of dates. The earliest gospel is Mark, as you said, written 40 years after Jesus' death, around 68 to 70 CE. Matthew and Luke follow around 80 to 90, and they were joined with John's Gospel, 90 to 100, and Paul's letters, which are the earliest, of course, 50 to 60, to become the New Testament. And this process took place over about a couple of hundred years, from 160 to 360 CE. One argument that's been made against these Gospels is that they were written later. What would be the date for the Gospel of Thomas?
That's a very good question. And you're right that this is absolutely one of the forms that arguments today about the text take. Now, people who say it is very late are pointing out that the actual text, which is now in Cairo, the only single copy we have of a text that was widely read all over Egypt. We know that because we find in the garbage dumps in Egypt, like Oxyrhynchus, many fragments of Sophocles, of Greek philosophy, of deeds and legal documents and receipts and bills and text. And there are fragments of the Gospel of John, of Matthew, and the Gospel of Thomas. And Thomas is just as widely read as the others. So these are Greek fragments which are found about the time of the Gospel of John. Those two are written, I think, very close to each other. But the actual text that we found is translated into Coptic, as I said, and it's written, inscribed in the 4th century. So critics will say, oh, it's very late, it's very derivative. It's only a pastiche of things taken from the New Testament Gospels. That seems to me not accurate, because it was certainly widely known and discussed by fathers of the church as early as the year 140. So these texts were known, and they were dismissed very early by some of the Orthodox bishops. But as you say, the formation of a New Testament, that didn't happen until after Constantine, between the years, say, 350 and 400. And there's that list is still in flux at that time. But the canon is a list of books to read in public worship. It would not ordinarily include mystical texts. And these are mystical texts. I used to think that their origin, as I said, was in Jewish mysticism, and I think there's a lot of connections there. But there are also wider connections with a much more multicultural population in Egypt and India.
So how they got written down? We know that Socrates' work was written down posthumously by his students, Plato and Xenophon. And I remember a professor of mine saying to me that she would not want even her very best student writing down her work from memory. So, but I guess this was customary in the ancient world. You say that we know almost nothing about the person Thomas, and he may have been less an author than a compiler, or there were several compilers.
Yes, most likely these collections. Of course, in societies where so many people do not read, they often learn by memory. And so their memories are much better than those of us who are brought up reading. I think the name Thomas is given to this text as a metaphor, because if you read the Gospel of Thomas, he is a kind of stand-in for you, the reader. And then, and then at the end, Jesus says, I will become you, and you will become me. So Thomas means the twin. You, the reader, the listener, the learner, can become the twin of Jesus. I think that's really to be taken metaphorically.
Thomas Christians were apparently an early group that thrived in the first century, like those devoted to Luke, Matthew, and John, in a tradition quite different from the Synoptic Gospels, as you have shown. And of course, the Acts of Thomas from 200 CE says that Thomas himself evangelized India. And we have Thomas Christians in our audience today, like Professor Matthew. And you've spoken a bit about the possibility of connections and contact with India through the Silk Route, because as you say, city people and travelers lived in a cosmopolitan world then and now. And Geeta Sen asks, what is the historical evidence for Jesus having spent many years in the Himalayas, learning from many spiritual teachers there? And she sees a similarity with Kashmir Shaivism to the Gnostic philosophy that you have described.
Well, it's a good question, and many people have asked it. I don't know of historical evidence that speaks of Jesus in India. There are a lot of stories, but we don't know. And whether he himself, as a village rabbi, could have made such a trip, we don't know. Although we don't have the teachings of Jesus himself, as you rightly point out. We have what his followers wrote down in generations after that. And some of them, as we spoke of before, you and I, we know that there were contemporaries of his early followers, like the scholar, the Greek philosopher Apollonius of Tyana, who went to India to learn, specifically to learn from Hindu sages, and specifically to learn Buddhist teaching in Egypt. And some of the conservative fathers of the church said, those people are heretics. Those sadhus who, by the Ganges, they are heretics too. So these traditions were rejected by Orthodox Christians in the West. And I don't know about the Thomas Church today. I think it has tended to become more part of Orthodox Christianity in the way it's formally presented, but it has a richer history than that.
Part of the extraordinary nature of the world you describe is this kind of picture of the lives of these early Christians, shocking portraits really of brutal persecution. I was particularly struck by the 22-year-old aristocratic young woman, Vivia Perpetua, from the African city of Carthage, who becomes a Christian. And, she's recently married with an infant son, and she's imprisoned. Her father is beaten in front of her, and then her body is torn apart by beasts in the arena. Christians were also rejected by families. The husband casts the wife out of his house. The father disinherits the son. The master commands the slave to depart from his presence. And yet they were drawn to this community that functioned really like an extended family. And they acted in extraordinary ways, staying to take care of the sick and dying during the plague, when everyone else was fleeing, including the doctors, which of course resonates with our own time of the pandemic. And their practice of loving kindness, even to the stranger or those of another tribe. It was all really quite remarkable reading about this world. And
it's very powerful to see, as you say, those who were drawn to the movement, like Vivia Perpetua, who was from an aristocratic family. But the followers of Jesus were considered criminals in the Roman Empire because they were atheists. They didn't believe in the gods. And the gods were understood, to be the support of the Roman Empire. And the whole structure of the society depended on the goodwill of the gods. And so it was a crime to be a Christian. As you say, they suffered terribly. And I think it is that enormous pressure of persecution, which Irenaeus, the bishop I mentioned, it pressured him to create a sort of specific church with specific beliefs. That is, I think it made him feel that it was very important to identify who's a Christian and what we believe, and create institutional structures so that there would be connections between, say, this group in France and that group in Rome and another group in Syria and another group in Germany, which otherwise might seem very disparate. So they created orthodox traditions to bind these groups, but that also created this exclusionary practice. I mean, it comes partly out of persecution, which I think is so important that you mentioned.
And even after Constantine made it the official religion and decriminalized Christianity, there was still a struggle that continued with the old ways, wasn't there, with his nephew Julian and so on?
Yes, well, after Constantine declared Christianity sort of the official religion of the Roman Empire, well, his nephew, who became emperor some decades after his death, actually Julian, it was quite a bit later, he hated Constantine because Constantine had killed several members of Julian's family in order to decrease the number of potential rivals to the throne. And so he felt that his relative Constantine was a bloodthirsty hypocrite. Constantine also killed his own wife when she was suspected of participating in a coup against him. So there was certainly resistance, and there was certainly a much wider world culturally. But Constantine created a closed church with a closed canon saying only these books, only these beliefs, only this path of salvation. And it became a very powerful, strong institution in the West, right? It still is. But I think it's time that we now open up the windows, let more air in, and realize that the world was never that closed.
What sustained many Christians, even more than belief, you say, was stories, above all, shared stories of Jesus' birth and baptism, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. And in a sense, these Gospels are shared stories. And some of these connections to earlier traditions as well that exist, you point out that Christmas, the birthday of Jesus, on December 25th, which is coming up, was celebrated from the 4th century on, and it coincided with the birthday of the Persian sun god Mithra around the winter solstice.
Yes, it is the birthday of the sun, and that is the symbolism of the divine Son of God related to the sun and the return of the sun and the birth of the new sun after winter darkness. That's where the symbolism comes from. But you also can see, I'd love to show you one more example of one of these texts, which is not Christian at all. There were some that were found with these secret Gospels. Some of them are Jewish texts. Some of them are mystical texts in different ways. They're not distinctively Christian necessarily. They open a much wider focus than that. So if I may, one more time, I'll just share with you. Is this there? If we go to this, there's a text like the Revelation of Zostrianos, which is simply the revelation about a young man who cannot find answers in his life. He is deeply depressed that his life seems to have no meaning. And he goes out into the desert alone to kill himself, to commit suicide. And he says, then he said, there was a light around me and a kind of cloud of light surrounded me. And I heard a voice say, have you gone mad? What's wrong with you, Zostrianos? He said he was taken up into an illumination. And when he came out of that experience, he said, then I came to understand that the light in me is greater than the darkness. And then he went out to become a teacher of spiritual wisdom. So this is another text, not Christian specifically, that came out of this discovery. But I'd like to also share with you one more. It's a wonderful poem because it's inspired so many people. And this again speaks to the culturally complex composition of some of these sources. This text is called Thunder, Complete Mind. And thunder in Greek, the word bronte, is feminine. And in this text, she speaks as a divine power. Thunder has always been understood as a divine voice. In this poem, she speaks, it's a long poem. I was sent from the power, I'm the first and the last, honored and scorned. I am the whore, I am the holy one. I am war, I am peace. She speaks as a power that speaks in everyone. She speaks as divine wisdom, using allusions to the Hebrew tradition in Proverbs as wisdom as a divine being. Also, feminine word in Hebrew, as is ruah. So spirit and wisdom are feminine, and wisdom speaks through thunder here. And she also speaks about being in the palaces in India and being in the garbage dumps, being everywhere. She pervades everything. She says, I am the one whose image is great in Egypt. And here it refers to the goddess Isis. The whole poem is written in the language, in the cadence also, of a chant to the goddess Isis. And it is probably chanted, it's probably liturgically performed, this poem celebrating the feminine divine power that is everywhere. She speaks also as Eve and alludes to the story of creation in the Hebrew Bible and says, I am she who is great in Egypt, but has no image among the barbarians. In this case, speaking of Jewish tradition, which speaks of God the Father, but of course there is no God the Mother in Hebrew tradition. And that's the voice that spoke to my colleague Toni Morrison, here pictured on the right. She did a series of poems and songs, and I heard these performed at Princeton once, and I said, Toni, that's amazing. What is that? She said, oh, that's thunder. You brought me to it. I said, thunder. She went back to this ancient poem and took pieces of it and wrote her own poems from it and songs, which are now illustrated in a book in the Firestone Library that she published herself. The same poem, Thunder, was used by Julie Dash, who's pictured at the bottom. She's a filmmaker in a film called Daughters of the Dust, about a religious tradition that comes out of Africa. And also by Leslie Marmon Silko on the top left, from a Native American tribe in Arizona. She used the same poem, Thunder, as speaking the voice of her people in a way against Orthodox Christian tradition. So all of these people found a kind of spiritual connection with these sources that come out of the Thomas tradition.
I'll take an audience question. Binu George asks, Professor, are there records of teachings of St. Thomas in India?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. So, of course, so much in the ancient world, probably 90% is lost. What we have written down is a small fragment. What was written that survives is much smaller than that.
And we have a comment from Nithila Peter, who says she's listening to you from India and understanding the relevance to our faith practice as Thomas Christians in an entirely new way. And you're opening up our hearts to the excitement of the Gnostic Gospels and taking on the journey of knowing oneself and seeking the light within. This is empowering, and this opens up our Christian faith to naturally connect with the wider philosophical currents of Vedanta yoga and the Buddha's psychological perspective on enlightenment. So that was just...
Well, I want to thank her for those lovely words, because it does seem to me that these traditions, whether they're Christian or whatever, they would die if they weren't renewed and transformed in every generation. And now we're in the 21st century. We're not in a closed off world. We're in a global world. And if we're going to understand the cultural traditions, say, of Christianity, they have to be understood in a much wider context than they were previously thought to be, or understood, or insisted on being. I mean, this tradition is kind of clamped down by the church, which says, no, no other gospels, no other teaching, no other mystical teaching which contradicts our teaching. And that kind of closure, I think, is inimical to the vibrancy of the traditions as they have developed for many thousands of years.
I will ask you a sort of methodological question about being a historian of religion. Among historians of India, there's been a recognition in recent years that more scholarly attention needs to be paid to the question of faith, which is such an integral part of daily life and a motivating force for so many. And yet there are conflicts of opinion between theologians and historians. As a historian of religion, how have you had to negotiate this divide?
That's a very important question. Thank you for that. Faith, at least in English, has different connotations. It can either mean belief in a set of theological convictions, the creed, I believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Does it mean belief in a set of dogmas, like the Nicene Creed? That's what some people call faith. But the Hebrew term and the Greek can also mean trust. It can mean the movement of the heart, right? And I think it seems to me that belief in specific theological statements is not something my students, for at least, are looking for. They're looking for experiential awareness, faith, in a sense, focused more on the heart than intellectually conceived theology. So that's partly why the Christian view of faith as belief in these statements in the creed is losing its power for many people who want something that is closer to their own experience and speaks more deeply to their heart, I want to say. The power of these traditions, as I understand them, speaks deeply to our emotions, and that's why music and poetry and chant and dance have always been deeply part of worship almost everywhere.
I am going to take an audience question that is a sort of practical question from Tayil Setumadhavan, who says, have the parchments that were discovered in 1945, have they been subjected to verification of authenticity, carbon testing, or anything like that?
They have, but they have, but what we have is not the original writing of a Gospel of Thomas. That would have been destroyed probably centuries ago, or in fragments, because we do find it in Greek fragments before it was translated into Coptic. So what we have are these 4th century papyrus translated from Greek into Coptic. Now, Coptic, the language of Egypt in the year 300 to 400, has a lot of connections with Greek, but it's different. So carbon dating that will get you to the 4th century. But actually, if you're asking about the Gospel of Thomas itself, when it was written, we don't have a physical copy of that. We only have Greek fragments, which can be dated, in fact, to the beginning of the 2nd century, which is where you find fragments also of the Gospel of John and of Matthew. Those two primarily are what were found at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. When people look for fragments of the earliest Gospels, they mostly find Matthew and John. And there's also Luke, but fewer of those, and fewer of Mark, actually.
Mohan Isaac asks, can you tell a little more about your personal tragedies and how you coped with them, the grief and the loss? You've spoken a bit about losing your child, and I guess he's asking after that what happened.
Well, yes, I didn't want to write a grief memoir because everyone knows about grief. we all know a lot about it. But there was a time when I did need for myself to contend with not only the loss of our only child at the time, but also of my wonderful husband of 22 years. He was a theoretical physicist and wonderful person. And we used to go to the mountains every summer where the physicists would gather from all over the world, and he would hike twice a week in the mountains. And he died in a mountain climbing accident a year after our son died, and right after we had adopted 2 other children. So I was left with 2 babies, and without the 2 members of my closest family, that was utterly devastating. And it was only a kind of experience I had after the funeral for our son. The experience was actually very unusual. It was at the service, standing at the back of the Church of the Heavenly Rest in New York, as our friends poured through the church. I had the sense of that there was an enormous net that surrounded us, and the net was made out of ropes that were huge, and the spaces between the ropes of this net were large enough for someone to just be sucked out of the world. And at that moment, I didn't want to be standing in that church in that moment, which was devastating. I just wanted to be out of the world because it was too painful. And I felt that the only thing keeping me in the world were the knots in this net, which were the connections with the people there, with the people that remained. That's all that was left. Later, people spoke about Indra's net. I hadn't been familiar with that image, but it was a sense of the connectedness of all people, and with those who are living, those who are gone, wherever they are. And so it was a sense of, how does one survive what you think you can't live through? I'm amazed. And so I only wrote later not to write about grief, because at the time I couldn't have written it, and it was too private. 30 years later, I was surprised that to be able to live through something I could not imagine living through, having raised those 2 adopted children, having come to a life that involved close friends and creative work and family, and say, this is amazing. People do survive so many things, worse things than I experienced. I know that. How do we do that? It's out of a sense of finding meaning and finding some kind of spiritual path. At least for me, that's what it took. So I wrote out of that celebration and the surprise of saying, I'm amazed that I can still be here and have joy with the people that, we love, with the world in its beauty. That's the surprise of it. And so I wrote about that.
And while you have a large body of scholarly articles, unlike most academics, you've also made a conscious effort to write books that are accessible, like this one, Why Religion, that reach out to a wider public. One reviewer calls them careful and thoughtful scholarship in the lively and exciting prose of a mystery writer. Could you tell us the inspiration for this? Because it takes so much effort to do both, sort of like having 2 parallel careers. Most people can manage only one.
You're totally right. And I came out of graduate school and I realized that I had been taught to write as if it were badly translated from German. They were, a lot of people were imitating European scholarship, and very ponderous and very technical. Now, I'd love to write in technical language because I could use Coptic and I could use Greek and use allusions that only other scholars would recognize. It's a kind of simpler shorthand for writing to people who are immersed in that particular work. But my husband was a theoretical physicist, as I mentioned. And his friends thought I was really strange because I was studying religion, which they thought was irrelevant to the world. My husband said when we first met, "Why don't you write about something that matters in the real world?" And I said, "Well, why do you write about elementary particles?" But because I wanted to share this work with people who knew nothing about it, including the theoretical physicists who actually now read this stuff, I decided to translate the technical articles from where they are in scholarly journals and monographs into language that people who do everything else in the world might read. And I love sharing it. So that's why I did it. And I've enjoyed it because it allows for so much wider conversation. But I still write technically in journals, and when that's the simplest way to articulate research discoveries.
You also said that while you've identified what you love about religious tradition, you're also quite clear about what you cannot love about it. Could you tell us?
I think that's so important that you brought that up. Thank you for mentioning that, because part of the study of the history of religion is not just infatuation with religious tradition. There's much about it that we need to be aware of. I mean, in Christian tradition, there was a point at which I was looking at the Gospels and came to understand that the Christian anti-Semitism is built into them. And I had not realized that. My own professor denied it stoutly. He said, "There's no anti-Semitism in Christianity." And he had just come out of Nazi Germany himself and been part of that. It was atrocious what he said. But there are ways that these traditions have been used to divide and denigrate other people, people who weren't Christians, people for all kinds of reasons. And so I think we need to be very aware of the damage that religious traditions can do. And I've seen many people feel that their sense of a spiritual experience has been trampled on or destroyed by people who said, "Well, that's nothing. That doesn't matter. There's nothing true about that. You have to believe this." And that kind of limitation, there can be a lot of false teaching in these traditions. I mean, many of us do not accept some of the views about women that you find in traditional religions, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or whatever. We say, "Oh, well, that's just part of the ancient stories," and it is. Fair enough, but we don't have to accept them. So I think the study of religion involves not only exploring them, investigating them, trying to understand them as well as we can, but also becoming critical of them, and finding, what we cannot accept. And that is helpful to me, at least.
But there's still room for Bach and Christian music and art and architecture, poetry that you say is, of course, so enormously rich. And it might have come from that Orthodox world, but it has a place in your life, certainly, you say.
Yes, I'm actually teaching a seminar, wonderful, with students with all kinds of backgrounds, and we're looking at the art, the painting, the music, the traditions, enormous traditions that go from classical traditions and ancient church songs to gospel music, to popular music, to films that are being made. So the life of Jesus, the stories of Jesus are being replayed, retold, recreated, reinvented, reimagined, as they have been by artists and poets and musicians for thousands of years. And there's a great deal of richness in that, as you say, because there's thousands of years of life poured into those stories as they are played and replayed.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time. Our deepest gratitude to Professor Elaine Pagels for speaking to us today from Princeton, New Jersey. As we head into the festive season in December, This has been an immersion into the world of the early Christians in antiquity. But your reflections also bring us to the present in a world that has seen so much suffering and loss with the pandemic in recent times. Your insights on facing storms of grief and hope are inspiring and seem more relevant than ever. Thank you. And thanks. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to speak with you, and I've really appreciated this conversation so much.
Thank you. And thanks also to our audience for tuning in. I should mention our program at the BIC tomorrow at 7 p.m., Carols in the City, with the choirs Capella Bangalore and the Bangalore Men. Many of you have tuned in from distant parts of the world today. You can sign up for our email notifications at our website, and please join us for our next program on BIC Streams. Thank you.